This is Introduction to Graphic Design, and in session 9 here we're going to be talking about modernism and the approach that modernism takes in solving design problems both visually and practically. I'm Alvalyn Lundgren. So in this episode we're going to take a look back into recent history, starting with the end of the Industrial Revolution and moving forward through the modern era. And in our next episode, we'll address postmodernism. And both of those approaches to design are viable today. So when we're talking about an approach, we're talking about a method or a certain way of addressing a design problem. The approach you take with something strongly affects the outcome. What you want to do as a designer is approach a design with as much information and as much knowledge as possible, so that you can solve the issues that the design is all about. Very often those issues, by necessity, involve an understanding of the whole timeline, shall we say, of design history, because you have to draw from that timeline. You have to draw from past movements. We build on previous movements. We're not where we are today by chance. Everything has been a stepping stone. Everything has been a movement toward where we are now. So understanding certain points of view as designers helps us craft our own individual points of view, makes our work a lot stronger. The reason we want to look at design history also is because we want to build a visual vocabulary. Graphic design and a lot of design disciplines are dealing with form language for specific reasons. In graphic design, we're dealing with form language in order to communicate, in order to persuade. So in becoming aware of past movements, styles, trends, and individual designers, we are adding to our visual vocabulary. We are better able to recognize how design elements are used and organized in a visual space. Another reason is to learn to see with understanding rather than simply look at something and dismiss it. We also want to acquire good taste. We want to understand what good design is. We want our ability to appreciate good design and to create good design to increase. We also want to be able to increase our own ability to communicate, both visually and verbally. By looking back on how things have been communicated in the past, we can draw from that. The more information you have, the more knowledge you have, the more you can apply it in a wise manner in your own work. You should want to appreciate the past, be inspired by it in the present, so that you can anticipate the future. As I said, we didn't get here all by ourselves in this day and age. Designers in the past have paved the way, and we are paving the way for future designers. So there's kind of this continuum, this legacy that's handed down, visual artist, visual designer to visual designer through generations. We draw our inspiration from them. We will be inspiring those to come. You also want to cultivate curiosity. Curiosity leads to curation. Curation is fodder for creation. We talked about that early on. So again, the more you see, the more you understand, the more you know, the better off you are in terms of coming up with appropriately clever and effective design solutions. To recognize that design is one of the oldest human pursuits. It's not the result of, nor is it reliant on, computer technology. There's a sense that, well, if I can just get on the software and do it in the software, it's going to be this amazing thing. When in actuality, a designer should be able to design no matter what tool they're using, because design is a thinking process, it's a problem-solving process. It's an understanding of visual space and how to arrange that visual space and what elements to include and how to relate them to each other so that the result is effective in its purpose. And people have been doing it for centuries and millennia without software. We also want to understand what good design actually looks like and why something is considered good design and why good design is important in culture and for communication, how it adds value The more you look at design, the more understanding you will have of how good design happens, how design principles are applied, and you'll build your vocabulary. Since we don't design ex nihilo or out of nothing, we have to draw on things we know. Your work will also not be entirely just you coming up with stuff. There are designers and artists that you like, that you're drawn to, and you're drawn to them for a reason. You like their work because of something about it. To understand how your work is influenced is helpful. And it's one way that you as a designer, because you don't sign your work, can make your work uniquely you, even though it's for a client. Knowing your influences, knowing where you get your own design predilections from, your own design preferences from, is a valuable thing to understand. It helps you understand who you are as a designer. So for instance, looking at this design by Alfred Roller, we can see a very strong influence and relationship to this, which came many years later. So this was influenced by that. So we want to talk about modernism, which is a period of art and design that began toward the end of the 19th century, was influenced in its origins by technology, and has influenced art and design, especially graphic design, ever since, and continues to do so. We are now in what's termed postmodernism, but under postmodernism, modernism has to have its place. And you may find that you have a preference for one over the other. So what modernism is there's a focus on pure form. Basically means it's a focus on the elements and the principles of design. So it's focusing on color, it's focusing on shape, texture, things like that, rather than trying to render an academic study of something. There's an exploration of how forms relate to each other within the visual space. It's an application of Gestalt design theory to undergird aesthetic principles, and a focus on making those aesthetic principles work. Modernism, rather than directly representing something, idealizes it or stylizes it, simplifies it in some way for specific purposes. There's a strong focus on color and color relationships and color perception. Color as a means to communicate. There's a focus on structure, the overall idea of how a design is built, the underlying foundation, grid structures, and then compositional arrangements within the design space. There's a focus on the process and the materials of design. How you accomplish the design solution is as significant as the problem that you're solving with that solution. So it's not just a matter of coming up with ideas, it's a matter of actually putting them into form. It's a matter of actually being able to fabricate or execute those solutions materially. Good process leads to a good result. Shortchanging your process can compromise your design solution. There's also a strong focus on self. I've said that designers don't sign their work, but modernism has given designers the ability to be self-expressive while still solving a design problem. So you can look at the work, say, of Wes Wilson and know that it's his work specifically, as opposed to a Victor Moscoso, or as opposed to a David Lance-Goins, or as opposed to an Andy Warhol. Although we don't sign our work, we can still put ourselves into our work and make it our own. Also in modernism, there's a focus on impressions, which is trying to make a visual impact. Especially in design, you want somebody to see something and remember it. This is especially true with branding, marketing, and advertising. You want people to remember and recall the visuals associated with the brand or with the idea or with the product that they're seeing. Modernism is also cross-genre and cross-discipline. You might be a graphic designer, but maybe you're also a copywriter or an illustrator. there are acceptable blends of different disciplines within visual communication and the design fields that are useful and helpful for your career, first of all, but primarily for the focus of your work and how it serves others. Okay, so this is going to be a whirlwind tour of the origins of modernism coming up into the later 20th century. Modernism actually began with an Asian influence. The ukiyo-e art movement in Japan in the mid-1800s was focused on depicting everyday life. It was the first time, really, that there was a sense of capturing the momentary situations, the momentary encounters that people had. Ukiyo-e loosely translates as floating world, so it's the idea of depicting what you see. And this is Ando Hiroshige, and as we take a look at this, we see a lot of texture, we see a little bit of atmospheric perspective, great distance and scale relationships. Hiroshige was known for landscape prints and depicting the seasons and depicting human beings out and about in the natural world. By putting the fish forefront, he's kind of wrapping this fish around the landscape that he's actually wanting you to focus on. So he's using the fish almost as a framing device. And although there's not really any linear perspective in this, there is a sense of a vast landscape looking back to Mount Fujiyama there in the distance. Another one of his, just depicting a moment in time. It's raining heavily. People are walking with umbrellas across a bridge. There's this poor guy out on a boat in the water. And it's just an ordinary scene. It's an everyday occurrence. Notice the division of space, the use of scale, the smallness of the people on the bridge versus the sense of vastness or greatness of the outdoor environment. Notice how the structure creates a visual pattern, and it's a lot more simple up here. So all of these visual devices are being used to communicate a story that people are going to connect with. So the design sensibilities of Japan especially, but of Asia, asymmetry, fairly simple backgrounds, the flatness, the outlines, the way figures and objects and foliage were depicted, including a lack of linear or mathematical perspective. These were all very different than traditional European art. In Europe, these elements were merged with Western tradition to create new styles. And so one of those styles, or the main emerging style in the late 1800s, was Art Nouveau, meaning new art. And Toulouse-Lautrec was one of the major players as a designer and illustrator. We can see here a drawing using outline, flat shape, pattern fill. There is a sense of linear perspective, there's a sense of scale. All these figures are depicted as silhouettes. There is hand lettering, so it's a combination of drawn image and letter forms, not typography, but letter forms. And shapes were starting to be used as symbols. And it's the combination of the various shapes and whatever this is, which is probably a pickup from here. So we come in from here, hit her hair, and then come down to the decorative thing here, which is very abstracted. It's this combination that gives people an understanding of the place and the time and what's going on in the scene that's being depicted. And these are all simplifications, these are all abstractions. In this poster, Lautrec was strongly influenced by the Japanese print tradition, the ukiyo-e and the Edo period. Flat silhouette, there's no modulation of color, there's no color change within the color areas. The drawing uses outline, contour line, interior-exterior contour, and then, of course, the hand lettering. Steinlen, very similar, little stylization to give that cat some personality, a decorative motif, asymmetrical balance, a curve from the eyes down into the pedestal that the cat's sitting on, hand lettering, flat color, outlines. The designer whose style is the archetype or the primary representative of Art Nouveau was Mouchat, Alphonse Mouchat. His dominant theme was a central female figure, made a hero of the female figure, surrounded by stylized forms and what are called foliate tendrils, and that's these things coming down. Those foliate tendrils are derived from plants and flowers. Mouchat's female characters basically were not of any specific age, nationality, or historic period. They were unemotional. They were calm and serene. They were kind of the still point around which all the movement of the stylized hair and garments and patterning flowed. This is a fashion magazine cover that shows Mouchat's ornamental pattern and the interplay between organic areas and areas left open for typography. So we have a combination here of hand lettering, stylized illustration, and surface design in the ornamented border. Art Nouveau was the first international style. It spread across Europe, across the pond into the United States. So it was considered an international style. And it was an influencer of later art and design movements. So in Germany, Art Nouveau was known as Jugendstyle, which means youth style. Little less evidence of foliate tendrils, but a lot of energy in how figures were drawn. The use of hand lettering. This by Otto Ekman. There was actually a magazine called Jugend. It focused on this youthful Art Nouveau style. One of the most known and most lasting trademarks was created by A.L. Rich for General Electric. This logo has not changed over the decades. So if you design something that is classic, that hits all the bells and whistles for good design, it becomes timeless, and there's no reason to change it even though the times change. In the Netherlands, Art Nouveau was called Nieuwe Kunst, and you can see that there's a different style of Art Nouveau here. We still have the foliate tendrils, but then we have all this linear fill going on, creating a different kind of pattern and definitely wrapping around the lettering. And again, it's hand lettering and not typography. Van de Velde was interested in the look and feel of the decorative and applied arts from past movements. He broke ground by how he filled space, how he recognized the negative space and called attention to the negative space in a design. So he combined different rhythms, line qualities, and he based his work, again, off of natural forms. The term historicism talks about using artistic styles directly drawn from history or imitating the work of prior artists and designers. So as Art Nouveau began and developed and spread, it drew increasingly on historic art and design. A movement that ran parallel to Art Nouveau was the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement was not necessarily inspired by Asian art. It was inspired by illuminated manuscript and the hand-built, hand-drawn, high-quality, handcrafted ideas, both in graphic design, in architecture, in furnishings, and in the decorative arts. So arts and crafts was a multidisciplinary movement. Art Nouveau was mostly visual, but arts and crafts spanned a greater range of application. And arts and crafts was a direct reaction against the Industrial Revolution and the shoddy quality of mass production and manufacturing methods. Unfortunately, arts and crafts movement was not really sustainable. It quickly kind of morphed into the Beaux-Arts movement, also called aestheticism, and that's where the phrase art for art's sake was coined, and that's the point at which fine art and design split and haven't really come back together. When you consider art for art's sake rather than art being a practical, functional thing in people's everyday lives, there is a different mindset. I talked about that early on, and that's where that happened, because prior to the arts and crafts movement, prior to the end of the Industrial Revolution, art and design were very much intertwined. A focus on ornament, decorative arts, emerged out of Art Nouveau. Our current discipline of surface design has its roots in ornament and the decorative arts of the late 1800s. So ornament is any design that's used to embellish an object or a surface. It's related to graphic design because it uses the same aesthetic principles, but it doesn't communicate, it decorates. We can see in this book cover by Grassert the combination of Art Nouveau and arts and crafts. I mentioned there was a focus on ornament, and so there were many books, this is one of them, that were published to train people or teach people how to construct ornamented patterns. Peter Behrens, mentioned earlier, was a multidisciplinary designer, an industrial designer, as well as a graphic designer. He illustrated and designed books. He dealt with typography. He dealt with industrial design. And he was a major figure in a later movement known as the New Objectivity. That eventually led into De Stijl and then to the Bauhaus. So this is a 6-color woodcut that was controversial because the figures are somewhat androgynous. But you can see the strong influence of Art Nouveau. And if you're familiar at all with psychedelic art in the late 60s and early 70s, you'll see that this was a strong influencing piece for that movement. The Vienna Secessionist movement, the Vienna Secession and the Glasgow School, Glasgow, Scotland, were rooted in Art Nouveau, but went in a very different geometric direction. And so the secessionist movement was short-lived, but you can see that there are rumblings of Art Deco in this, and there's rumblings of later design and current postmodern design in this. There's rumblings of strong grid system design. So abstracted figures, limited color palettes, flat colors, an emphasis on bold use of line, and not just for contours, but everything is stylized and abstracted into a kind of geometry. They use sans serif lettering, slab lettering, patterns that integrated text and illustration and ornament all together as a unified whole. So the lettering wasn't separate from the design, the lettering helped express the design. The use of repeated forms to create patterns is significant in the secessionist movement. Again, it was short-lived. It was a response or a reaction to Art Nouveau and influenced Art Deco later on. Aubrey Beardsley was a secessionist artist. Back to Peter Behrens and the New Objectivity. Behrens liked to play around with geometry. He used grids to structure his designs, and he introduced an approach based on geometry and composing with geometry. So the idea is that you build something out in modules or spatial cells. The use of modules as building blocks of a design actually started with him. You can subdivide the module or you can duplicate it and repeat it. So because of that subdivision, you start with the overall space, then subdivide it. Everything within the design becomes appropriately proportional to the total design space. His work ended up pushing later modern design toward geometry as a way of organizing things visually. This is a catalog page or part of a catalog page for a tea kettle that comes in 3 different versions. It's a spec sheet. It's a grid. There's a lot of geometry here. The space is divided appropriately. There is a strong relationship to current day website design. So in the United States, Art Nouveau resulted in, again, flat color, contour line exterior and exterior, linear patterns, the use of intense color, the use of simple and more complex areas. Not as much use of the foliate tendril that Mouchat was so well known for, but you see how linear elements are used to create pattern and texture. Note also this ad. There's basically nothing to it except royal baking powder, which I believe is still being manufactured today. But how different this is from the other 3 ads on that page. Ethel Reed was a well-known female illustrator. This is in 1895. Again, use of pattern, contour line, and this one actually uses typography, but notice how certain letter forms are in a different color. Edward Penfield was known for compressing space into a single visual plane, so that where you have 5 overlapping figures, they actually all appear on the same visual plane rather than on receding planes from foreground to background. And Maxfield Parrish was another very well-known American illustrator coming out of the Art Nouveau tradition. Pictorial modernism focused on poster as the graphic environment, and the purpose was advertising. Pictorial modernism reduced everything to color blocks so that you got rid of everything else and used color and shape and design space to project a powerful message via minimal visual information. Pictorial modernism was all about what's known as reductive simplicity. You reduce everything to its simplest form that communicates powerfully with a punch. Following close on the heels of pictorial modernism and strongly influenced by the new objectivity and Art Nouveau, as well as Cubism and historicism of Egyptian design, Art Deco is all about geometry. Not just graphic design, it was architecture, it was decorative arts, it was industrial design. Another influence for Art Deco was Russian constructivism. Constructivism is strong geometry, pure color, uses sans serif letter forms. And it also used photomontage, which is the integration of photographic elements into design. Constructivism was influenced by film and cinema and interested in communicating through flat space, flat color, and high energy movement and rhythms within the design. Out of that, and also somewhat influenced by Cubism, somewhat influenced by Art Deco, was De Stijl. De Stijl was directly responsible for the emergence of the Bauhaus and its De Stijl was Theo van Doesburg and Piet Mondrian. So you can see here something brand new. There's a diagonal radial axis. There's 2 axes. There's one going this way and there's one going this way. So nothing is plumb or level in this design. And so this is a new visual expression. Another piece of De Stijl graphic design. Again, using the diagonals, but still using a strong sense of geometry. De Stijl was also known as neoplasticism. It focused on the interplay of geometric form, what was called the perfect straight line, and Cubism. It was strongly influenced by Cubism. It was a movement that covered architecture, industrial design, and graphic design. And as I said, it paved the way for the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus developed in Germany. It was a design school. And much of the way design is taught today, including color theory, design principles, things like that, a foundational course of study before specializing, that's all Bauhaus idea. Bauhaus epitomized the idea of form and function working together. So the form of the design directly affects the function. So the form of this design affects how it communicates. And Bauhaus was shut down because of World War II. It was shut down by the Nazis. And the teachers and students dispersed, and a lot of them came to the United States and started schools here and influenced the New York School and influenced West Coast design and influenced architecture. So the Bauhaus was kind of a springboard. This is called a typophoto. It's entirely composed in front of the camera, not at the drawing board. So you have various elements that are put together and the film exposed and then the photograph printed. And it combined typography and photography. The typography is not superimposed on the photo, it's actually part of the photo. The new typography emerged out of the Bauhaus, and Jan Tschichold was the pioneer for a new approach to typography. It was a rational approach that form follows function. Beauty comes from holistic organization within a design, and there's no need for embellishment. Gestalt theory became a major player in design, the whole design being made up of its parts. The whole is greater than the parts. Every element in the design is part of the design, including the negative space as a supporting role. There was a strong sense of asymmetry, strong use of asymmetry. It was preferred over symmetry because it's more dynamic. The use of sans serif unadorned type, a flush left margin, in other words, everything was aligned to the left. Vertical, horizontal structures underlying the designs. The spaces in between are as important as the visible design elements. The use of rules and bars and boxes to indicate the structure, but also to separate and create hierarchy within the design, also to create emphasis. Photography was preferred over illustration because it was more direct and honest and objective. And Tschichold's design practice, his sensibilities, his approach became the standard for books, printing, ads, posters, things like that. He was threatened by the Nazis in the early 30s for being un-German in his approach to art and design. He was arrested and then released, went to Switzerland, and then actually started changing his approach and embracing classical typography in a different sort of way. But his contribution of visual hierarchy, how space is organized, how type and image are arranged together to function, and how to create focal points, how to concentrate and disperse elements, all of that was Tschichold. We can summarize his work as being focused on principles of asymmetric balance, the use of photography, and sans serif typography. After the Bauhaus was closed and people came to the United States, its philosophies and approaches influenced design in the United States, East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast. Tschichold's approach to typography was not easily accepted, except by a few American designers, Dwiggins, Armitage, and Lester Beall. They recognized the value of these new ideas and implemented them, and the new typography and modernism in graphic design slowly gained ground in editorial design and publications. Those ideas directly affected corporate graphics in the United States. And by the 1940s, modernist design became a significant influence in America. Alexei Brodovich was a well-known editorial designer in the United States. He was responsible in large part for assisting new talent such as Richard Avedon and Irving Penn and Art Kane to gain a foothold with their work. He did a lot of work for Knoll Associates furniture manufacturers. He used photographic images, interesting compositions, and broke ground in paving the way for postmodern sensibilities. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Swiss style, also known as the international style, and we have that style to thank for Helvetica, was focused on using pure form to communicate complex ideas and information. No emotion, a use of asymmetry, a use of sans serif type, the idea of researching what you're trying to communicate so that you know how to communicate it, so that by understanding you're able to invent forms that become symbols of complex ideas. So here we see within the Swiss style a strong simplicity, an allusion to certain forms to communicate libraries and books, and to certain color and common motifs to indicate the United States. The New York School emerged in mid-century, mid-20th century, based on Bauhaus principles, also based on the international or Swiss style, but added the usual American humor and whimsy. Paul Rand was able to analyze a message, to look at what needed to be communicated, what was primary, secondary, and tertiary in terms of messaging. He was able to reduce it to essential symbols and communicate the message in a dynamic way. He would alter or juxtapose commonly understood signs, symbols, and semiotics to reinterpret something or support a message. Doyle Dane Bernbach was an ad agency on Madison Avenue, and they developed a strategy of looking at what the advantages of a product or service were. They would look at the distinguishing characteristics or superior features of the product and create a visual-verbal relationship of form. Concept became dominant in advertising because of this advertising firm. And because concept dominated over presenting the visual appeal and the features and so forth, the ads used only the basic visual elements necessary to convey the concept. So the advertising was straight, direct to the point, involved headline, visual, and descriptive copy. So the big image, the supporting headline, and then small amount of descriptive copy, and then the advertiser's identity, and became the dominating approach to advertising. So advertising and graphic design go hand in hand. Sometimes advertising is seen as separate. And certainly if you major in advertising, you're more about the marketing and the stats and demographics and psychographics and things like that. But you can't advertise anything without graphic design. What DDB did was shift what advertising was all about. It went to benefits, it went to messaging. So all of these actually emerged out of the Bauhaus school into Swiss design, into the New York school, and kind of blew out and affected everything in commerce and marketing via advertising. Here, word and image are blended into a conceptual expression. The focus was on the versatility of the product and the differentiation of the product. This was a very effective series of ads and very successful for Volkswagen. Also coming out of the New York school was the idea of the typogram, where the typography became the image. So this Lublin design, very well-known type designer and graphic designer, used an interplay of word and image, fused them together into an expression of an overall concept, so that the image and the typography are entirely interdependent upon each other. So this is called a typogram. A lot of logos are typograms. Bradbury Thompson is another designer of note coming out of the New York school. He was probably the most influential designer in the 50s and 60s. He used bold shapes, he overlapped them, he made them transparent, he used geometric shapes, he used graphic symbols, he used letter forms as patterns, he took halftones and enlarged them so that they became part of the overall design, the visual pattern and the movement in the design. He was focused on formal harmony, readability, not just legibility, also reaching back to old-style typography and brought it forward and combined it with new approaches to organizing space, layering visual planes. A lot of what he was all about in his work paved the way for postmodern sensibilities and approaches to design. So as I said, graphic design is very much involved in advertising, design, and marketing. You can't do advertising or marketing without visuals. People respond to visuals first. And so let's look at these three ideas. Advertising is basically any paid persuasion by a sponsor or marketer. Advertising is closely related to propaganda. Propaganda is persuasion. Propaganda is usually seen as negative, but really It's benign. It's just what's being communicated in the propaganda. So advertising is kind of like paid propaganda. It's paid persuasion to propagate ideas or propagate actions and habits to form. So advertising is just buying space or buying a platform to share your message. In its persuasion, advertising wants people to take action. It wants them to buy something. It wants them to act on something. It wants them to understand something. So advertising is not branding. Advertising is not corporate identity. It's not visual communication systems. It basically utilizes brand assets and helps craft story around those assets. Ad agencies are not the same as design firms. So let's take a look at the difference between an ad agency, a design firm, and a corporate in-house art department. An ad agency is usually a single office or multiple offices, often international these days. They will generally have at least 3 departments. There's the creative, and that would be the writing and the visual. There's a public relations, which deals with actually distributing the creative work into the public square. And then there's marketing and research to analyze and understand market trends, statistics, psychographics, demographics, and results of the advertising efforts. There can be more departments, but these are usually the big 3. Ad agencies work cross-media and cross-platform. There are agencies who specialize in social media. There are agencies that do print, television, and social media. So it depends upon the agency and its size and its focus. Agencies usually work on an annual contract, or they will have a contract for a number of years. And sometimes you'll hear, especially if you read Advertising Age or Adweek, you'll hear that somebody is shopping. A brand is getting ready to leave one ad agency, so they're shopping. So everybody is concerned about who they're looking at, and people and agencies will pitch to get the business and things like that. And as I said, agencies will have regional and even international offices, so they're usually, these days, not just a single office. A design firm generally is smaller, and its focus is a little bit different. A design firm can be a office, a larger business, it can be a partnership, it can be a single person sole proprietorship. Design firms are generally smaller. They can focus on a wide range or a limited range of services. They can focus on a particular market sector. Some design firms only focus on, say, helping personal trainers to market, or they only focus on helping fashion businesses market, that type of thing. Design firms are involved with branding, with the visual look and feel of a brand. They may have retainer contracts. A lot of times there will be a project-by-project basis contract with clients. And there will be a more specialized scope of work. They won't necessarily get involved in trafficking, in placement of ads. They don't get involved in advertising or copywriting so much. They are much more visually oriented and smaller. Now, an in-house art department is usually going to be focused on the goals of the business. So a lot of the entertainment companies like Sony or NBC or Fox will have in-house art departments that do branding and that do, that they create all the visual stuff around certain of their assets. They will use an outside advertising agency for placement and PR and research and such. But the staff of creative people are focused on developing branded assets for the particular products or franchises of the company. So if you work at an ad agency, if you work at a design firm, your work is going to be broader, your scope of work, your focus will be broader. Usually you'll be working on different projects for different clients. When you work in-house for a corporation or a company, you are only focused on what that company is doing. With the in-house company, you can really help build the brand or build the influence of that company. If you're at a design firm or an ad agency, your focus is going to be a lot broader, and you're taking what's been built and distributing it out to the world.